Hello, in this video I will talk about how to find the square roots. I'll talk about the definition of squares, square roots, and how to simplify square roots using their properties. So I hope you enjoy the video. So first of all, let's figure out what do we mean by the square of a number. So the square of a number is obtained by multiplying it by itself. So for example, the square of 2 is 2 times 2, which is 4. The square of 3 is 3 times 3, which is 9. And the square of 4 is 4 times 4, which is 16. So in order to find the square of any number, all you need to do is multiply it by itself. So here is the notation that we use for the square of a number. So if a represents a number, then its square is represented by a squared. So for example, the square of 2 is represented as 2 to the power 2 equals 4. And then square of 3 is written as 3 to the power 2, which is 9. And then square of 4 is written as 4 to the power 2, which is 16. So that is the notation. Here are your first 25 squares. So it's a very good idea if you are going to do math at any level to memorize these first 25 squares. It will save a lot of time, cut down on the use of your calculator. Can you do without memorizing these squares? Of course you can, but will it save you time if you can do these squares without having to grab a calculator? Definitely. So I highly encourage every math student to make an effort to memorize at least the first 25 squares. Now, what do we mean by the square root of a number? So the inverse of square is the square root. So when you multiply a number by itself, you get its square. And then when you ask yourselves the question, what number do I need to multiply by itself to get a given number? Then you're trying to figure out the square root. So 4 is the square of 2. It means that the square root of 4 is 2. So if you know that a certain number is the square of some number, then you can find the square root as well. So square root of 4, that's the notation, and the square root sign sometimes is also called the radical sign. So you can read it as the square root of 4 is 2. And then in general, if b is the square of a, then a is the square root of b. So that is how you would write b equals the square of a. That implies that the square root of b equals a. So here are again the same 25 numbers that we saw earlier as squares. Now we are seeing them as square roots. So for the square, if you take the square root, you get the original number. So square root of 1 is 1, square root of 49 is 7, square root of 196 is 14, because 14 squared is 196. So square root and square, they are inverses of each other. They're inverse operations of each other. Now there are two properties of square roots which we will be using. The first is called the product property. So the square root of a times b is equal to the square root of a times the square root of b. And the other is the quotient property. The square root of a over b, or the square root of a divided b, equals the square root of a divided by the square root of b. So now we can find or simplify a radical using prime factorization. So what we want to do is we want to simplify square root of 243. So the first thing I do is I start with a factor tree. So 243 is divided by 3, and that will give me 81. So 3 I know is a prime number. So then I say 81 is actually 9 times 9, and then 9 I can say is 3 times 3. So that's a prime number. That's another prime number. And then 9 is also 3 times 3. So that means what I can do here is I can say 243 under the square root is actually equal to 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 and then times 3, because if you go back here and count how many times did you put circles around the 3, that's 5 times. So this can now be written as square root of 3 squared times square root of 3 squared times 3, and then you can take the square root. Now each square is kind of undone by the square root, so I can write this as 3 times 3 and then times square root of 3. So the 3 times 3 is 9, and then I can say this is equal to square root of 3. So square root of 243 simplifies to 9 times the square root of 3. Let's see some examples as we try to use these properties. So I've got 75. What I need to do is first of all make a factor tree. So 75 is 5 times 15, and then I can say 15 is 5 times 3. So there's a prime factor. Each prime factor has been put inside a circle. So 75 is now equal to 5 times 5 times 3 under the square root, which I can write as 5 times 5 under the square root times 3. And anytime you see a number multiplied by itself under the square root, that's actually its square. So I can write this as square root of 5 squared times 3. And the square root and the square, they are inverse operations. They undo each other. So the square root of 75 simplifies to 5 times the square root of 3. Here's another example. Let's see if we can simplify the square root of 108. And the first thing I will start off with is prime factorization. So 54 times 2 gives me 108. So 2 is a prime number. And then 2 times 27 gives me 54. So 2 is a prime number. And for 27, I see it's 3 times 9. Again, 3 is a prime number. Every time I get a prime number, I'll put a circle around it. And then 3 and 3. So here's my factor tree for 108. So now I can say 108 under the square root equals 2 times 2 times 3 times 3 times 3 under the square root. And this is a group of 2. So this is 2 squared times 3 squared times 3 under the square root. So this is square root of 2 squared times square root of 3 squared times square root of 3. And square root of 2 squared is 2. Square root of 3 squared is 3 times the square root of 3. And 2 times 3 equals 6. So the square root of 108 simplifies to 6 times square root of 3. Here's another example, 24 over 25 under the square root. So 24 over 25 under the square root is 24 square root divided by 25 square root. So 25 square root is actually 5 times 5 under the square root. And now the next thing we need is prime factorization for 24. So that's 2 times 12. And then 12 is 2 times 6. And 6 is 2 times 3. So 24 can actually be written as 2 times 2 times 2 times 3 under the square root. So that can be written as 2 squared times 6 under the square root over 5 squared under the square root, and that can be written as 2 squared under the square root over 5 squared under the square root times 6 under the square root. And 2 squared under the square root is 2, 5 squared under the square root is 5, and then times square root of 6. So square root of 24 over 25 simplifies to 2 over 5 times square root of 6. Let's simplify 120 square root over 136 square root. So First thing obviously I need is a factor tree for 120. So 120 is 10 times 12, and then 10 is 2 times 5, and 12 is 2 times 6, and 6 is 2 times 3. So I have my prime factorization for 103. In a similar way, I need a prime factorization for 136, and I will say this is 2 divided by, so let me grab my calculator, 136 divided by 2 is 68, and 2 is a prime number. 68 gives me 2 times 34, and 34 gives me 2 times 17. So now I have my prime factorization for 136 as well. So I can write 120 over 136 under the square root equals, so I got 1, 2, 3. So here I see there are 1, 2, 3 times 2, and then times 3, and then times 5, and they all go under the square root. And then divide that by square root of 2 times 2 times 2 times 17, and they are all under the square root. Now if you notice, there are 3 square roots and square roots of 2. So what I can do is I can say, hey, square root of 2 times square root of 2 times square root of 2 times square root of 3 times square root of 5 divided by square root of 2 times square root of 2 times square root of 2 times square root of 17. So I'm just trying to expand it as much as I can. And once I've expanded them, then the square root of 2 divided by square root of 2 gives me 1. Square root of 2 divided by square root of 2 gives me 1. And then square root of 2 divided by square root of 2 gives me 1. And then I can actually combine the square root of 3 times square root of 5 and say square root of 15 over square root of 17. So that's one way in which you can simplify square root of 120 over 136. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up sign, subscribe to this channel, and do not forget to turn notifications on by hitting the bell icon. If you would like us to make a video on a certain topic, please write us an email at info@sageeducational.com. And if you have a question, a problem that you want to get a video solution to, please email that problem to info@sageeducational.com. Contact us if you need academic help. We provide in-person and online tutoring for all subjects.